Picking up where we left off yesterday, just the overall consequences of the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise is going to delay civil war by a decade. If you remember, Southerners, fire-eating Southerners, were considering a convention, and the convention did take place after the Compromise was made, but the fire or the motivation for secession had been addressed by the Compromise of 1850, but they had considered secession at a Nashville convention. Okay? So with that decade of time following these series of compromises, it actually benefits the North considerably. That's a whole extra decade where the North is expanding its railroads, where it's expanding its commercial enterprises, where immigrants continue to flood in from places like Ireland into northern manufacturing centers. So your book wants you to believe, or your book makes the argument, the Compromise of 1850, even though it prolongs and extends slavery, it amps up the mistreatment of fugitive slaves, and it really violates the rights of northern states, it may be argued that the Compromise of 1850 helped the North win the war in the long run. Okay? Because the North economically, politically, population-wise is going to strengthen. The fugitive slave laws are going to anger not just the radical abolitionists, but it's going to upset people who believe northern states have a sovereign right to decide how to handle fugitives. If bounty hunters are coming into their territory, kidnapping these individuals, demanding to use jails, and transporting them back to the South, that feels like a violation of state sovereignty. And so all of that is going to ratchet up the rhetoric, ratchet up the emotions, and hostility between the two sections. All right, so where then do we start to go back towards division, back towards secession? And we have to address this kind of in a roundabout way. And we bring in a character by the name of Stephen Douglas to answer it. We have to look at the election of 1852 for a moment, because this is going to be the end of the Whigs. Now, I talked about the winner, the president that wins the election of 1852, Franklin Pierce. I referenced him yesterday. He's going to be the president that considers whether or not to purchase Cuba. He's going to get wrapped up in the Ostend Manifesto scandal, offering Spain $120 million for the purchase of Cuba. It outrages Northerners. This idea that we're going to purchase territory specifically for the expansion of slavery frustrates abolitionists and free soilers alike. Okay? Pierce is a Democrat. What happened to the Whigs? Well, the Whigs, as we saw with the Compromise of 1850, and as always, being jellyfish, are divided on the issues. And so we have Northern Whigs, Southern Whigs, neither side wholly happy with any kind of compromise. And I think I said this yesterday. A lot of people believe compromise is leaving everyone happy. I think a truly good compromise leaves everyone a little upset. And most upset probably were the Whigs. So the Whigs put General Winfield Scott, you remember, a big hero of the Mexican-American War, out there. His nickname is Fuss and Feathers. Scott is really kind of lukewarm on all of the issues, and he is defeated by Franklin Pierce. So what we want to focus on here now is how support for the Compromise of 1850 is going to lose the Whigs' support from free soilers. Okay? Anti-slavery Whigs in the North, like Winfield Scott. Again, he's a populist, just like Zach Taylor had been, known for his military success, but they're not fans of his platform. Whigs in the South, to say they like the Missouri Compromise is a bit much, but Whigs in the South are appeased by the Missouri Compromise, so they are supportive of the platform, but they're not especially hopeful about Winfield Scott, a northerner, as the candidate. Okay, why are we pausing here to talk about the election of 1852? The division the Whig Party experiences is going to divide the Whigs and end it as the major party. Okay, it's going to open the door then for the Republican Party to come in. But it's also very important to note that we're going to go into a time period here where sectional political interests and not national political interests are dominant. Okay? The book says the two-party system is ended or suspended during this time. So we are officially in the era of civil war. When Abraham Lincoln runs for president as a Republican, he won't even appear on Southern ballots. Imagine how the South would feel when candidate Lincoln becomes President Lincoln without a single Southern vote. It reiterates their sense that if the North gains an advantage, it will disregard all interests of Southerners. Okay? Now, how do we get to Kansas, Nebraska from there? Well, keep in mind that the spirit of manifest destiny, this idea that the United States needs to and should continue to expand across the Western Hemisphere, is still in effect. Okay, just because Polk left office doesn't mean Americans aren't feeling a sense of entitlement to the continent. And especially Southerners, as we mentioned in the last lecture, are advocating for more territory, especially towards the South in Latin America. A couple of territories come to mind, not only Cuba, but Nicaragua and parts of what are known as New Granada, or what you know as Colombia. Now, Colombia today does not have the same borders as Colombia during 1852. Colombia during 1852 would extend up to what we think of as Panama. See where I'm going with this? The Panama Canal has a very significant role in American history and American might. The notion that the United States was destined to control territory from Atlantic to Pacific comes with the burden of transportation. There is fear, and I know this is part of your study guide, there is fear that the Western states may not feel loyalty, unity towards the nation and its political center back on the eastern side of the continent. And without a railroad or without some kind of transportation system that connects east and west, the US government won't be able to control all that expanse. All right? So we're looking for new territory. We're looking for a way to connect Atlantic with Pacific. And the shortest distance between the two oceans is the region you know as Panama, okay? Franklin Pierce's administration is going to strike up a treaty with New Granada, or what you know as Colombia, where we are able to engage in some commercial activity there, including building the first transcontinental railroad. Now, when you think of transcontinental railroad, you think of the Union Pacific that goes through Nebraska. But that is not the first effort or first attempt to build a transcontinental railroad. The first one is going to span across what's known as Panama today. At the same time, we're competing with our old nemesis, Great Britain. Great Britain, as we had talked about prior to the Mexican-American War, has a interest in what we would call today as Nicaragua. And if you look at, and for those of you that are in AP geography, hopefully you can see it in your mind's eye, but Nicaragua has a huge lake. It's actually easier to go from Atlantic to Pacific through Nicaragua. The terrain is more forgiving. You have a big lake called Lake Nicaragua there that can be used for shipping. No need to create a channel. And then really what you need to do is cut through some dense forest on either side of Lake Nicaragua, and you've got yourself a canal. Well, control over this route is going to once again ratchet up military tensions between the two nations. And Pierce quickly strikes out a treaty with Great Britain, allowing for cooperative economic competition in this region and no military fortification. This particular treaty is called the Bulwer Treaty. Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. Jimmy Fallon, you remember the episode of Jimmy Fallon where you're like, oh, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is just the poor man's Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. And so, yes, AP history nerds, this is one of those little tidbits of historic information you need to recognize, not so much because it was making a huge difference in 1850, but it is going to come back to us when we get to Teddy Roosevelt in the turn of the 20th century, right? As we start to look at building the Panama Canal. Okay, so Teddy Roosevelt will look toward these agreements as justification for our ability to build and fortify the Panama Canal, which we will control for over a century. Okay, and it's also going to push us in the direction of building the true transcontinental railroad. How so? Okay, well, here's our map, by the way. Here you can see Nicaragua, Lake Nicaragua. Makes it much easier to go from Atlantic to Pacific. But the United States is in an alliance with Colombia, New Granada, and has access towards the region that today consists of the Panama Canal. But we need a railroad in the United States. And Pierce is encouraged by Southerners to build a railroad with a southern route. Okay, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean near what today would be San Diego, right? It will go through the Mexican Cession. One of the reasons that Pierce is considering this southern route is because there's already territorial government there, right? You've got Texas, it's a state, and you've got New Mexico. It's already been given territorial power. It already has the military there to take care of Indian problems. And the topography is more forgiving. Think about the current railroad today, you've got to go through the Rocky Mountains. That is not easy. The southern route would go through the Sonoran Desert. There is some rough terrain, and hence Franklin Pierce sends his emissary, James Gadsden, to Mexico to work out a treaty to purchase this little chunk of land. This is significant not only in that it's going to increase the efforts of Stephen Douglas to try to get a central route where it won't be a sectional issue, but it also gives us our final shape of the continental United States. There's a great documentary called How the Country Got Its Shape, where it deals with the shape of each state and what borders and boundaries and the history behind that. It's a great series. It's long, but we are officially at the point where the continental United States has its current form and substance. Okay, the Gadsden Purchase is going to buy a little stretch of land, and there is the proposed Southern Pacific Railroad route from Houston to Los Angeles. Tucson, Arizona, you could see was part of the Gadsden Purchase. Now we have the nice southern border. Okay. So what was Stephen Douglas's problem? Doesn't this tie the East with the West? And isn't this a good enough plan? It's certainly less expensive than carving through the center of the country. Right. Well, some people are concerned that if the South controls the railroad, it becomes a sectional issue. But I think Senator Douglas's interests were a little more personal than that. Okay? Douglas wants to make a compromise between the two sections to put the railroad smack dab in the center for a number of different reasons. I think, and this may be me being a little bit cynical, his investment in a railroad company was his primary reason for wanting to see a more centralized transcontinental line. Okay. Stephen Douglas, senator from Illinois, and there's going to be another famous politician from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, and we're going to have some really great speeches to read thanks to the debates Senators Douglas and Lincoln engage in over the issues of slavery. But at this particular time, 1854, Douglas wants to bring sectional leaders together to try to make a compromise dealing with the route of the railroad. Well, what have we learned? If you want to receive something, you have to be willing to give something. And for this central line to go through mostly free territory, the North is going to have to make some concessions to the South. Here's what Douglas proposes, because it worked so well in the Missouri Compromise. To open up the Nebraska territory to popular sovereignty, and to divide that territory into two sections, Nebraska and Kansas, so that each section could vie for one of those new territories. The assumption being, well, free soilers will move to Nebraska, slavery interests will move to Kansas, and we add territories in future states, one for each region. Then we put the railroad right through it in this little cow town called Omaha. Okay? So a little bit of a close-up here. You can see Iowa, free soil, Missouri, slavery territory. Douglas takes something that wasn't, well, it had been controversial, but had pretty much been iced over thanks to the Missouri Compromise, and he opens that can of worms up again, and now we are back to sectional debates. Douglas didn't really care about the issue of slavery. Some people think that this was the long game for Douglas was to get elected as president, that he was gunning for the presidency, a bid for president in 56. And of course, he would run in 1860. But this was a chance again for Southerners to increase their territory and open up more room for slavery. The one big problem with Douglas's plan is that he really underestimated Northern opposition to this. You think back to 1820, the whole Missouri Compromise left Louisiana Purchase, that Louisiana territory, free. And now slavery, with the addition of Texas and the Missouri Compromise and Kansas, slavery seems to be creeping further and further north. Douglas Hatches a Slavery Problem is the name of this cartoon. You'll note that the Missouri Compromise has already hatched. And like a big eagle, eagles or snakes, notorious for eating other birds' eggs, this looks like it's doomed to not last. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is one of the most important measures of this time period because it's going to create a slippery slope towards civil war. We've opened that can of worms up again. Anti-slavery Northerners are frustrated. The South is frustrated that the North won't compromise. Seems like every time the issue of slavery is brought up, the South has its back to the wall. The sense of moral superiority from the North really angers Southerners. You think about today how Republicans and Democrats interact, and oftentimes they treat each other as morally, ethically inferior. That's the kind of tension and bullheadedness that we're dealing with at this particular time in history. The fugitive slave law became a big issue here because it's a matter of, are we going to allow slavery to expand into a place before it becomes a state or only after? So both the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850 are at stake here with this particular set of legislation. Both sides are going to send recruits to these new territories. From Iowa, Free Soilers are going to pour over into Nebraska and into Kansas. When we have the votes on whether to make it free or slave in Kansas, there are people from Missouri that go over and cast ballots illegally and help Kansas turn into a slave state. Northerners retaliate against that by setting up their own government. So for a time being, Kansas had two territorial governments. One that was the legitimate government based on illegal votes, and the other, an illegal government based on the sense that what had been done was unjust, and a demand for a recount was there. Another product of the Kansas-Nebraska Act is the Republican Party. We can credit the Midwest for the Republican Party. There's a, I'm going to table what my thought there is. I got to get the details back, but I was going to use a current event. Okay. So the Republican Party is going to take in the elements of Southern Whigs that were opposed to slavery, Northern Whigs that were opposed to slavery, Democrats that were opposed to slavery, Free Soilers, Know Nothings. It's going to be kind of a catch-all for the nation as the Whig Party disappears, but it's not going to be allowed in the South. Questions about the Kansas-Nebraska Act at all? Now we're going to see some other historic events that follow this. For example, John Brown and his murderous rampage. We'll see a whole series of violence that becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. So be sure you read through some of that stuff. But we needed to look at the Kansas-Nebraska Act as a big step towards breaking the compromise and the sort of peace that was established in 1850. Okay, part B of this lecture then is about Commodore Perry. Okay. Another one of these little side notes. So just like the Panama Canal, we have a future with our relationship with Japan that begins in this particular time period. The United States, now having territory with California on the West Coast, is a Pacific power, right? Some of us, when we get to World War II, it's hard to realize this, it's hard to think of it this way, but the only thing that stands between the United States and Japan, right, other than 3,000 miles of distance, is little old Hawaii and Pearl Harbor. I mean, Japan and China are our backdoor neighbors in a sense. So with the acquisition of California, the United States becomes a Pacific power, or hopes to be a Pacific power. And we capitalize on resentment those Asian countries have towards the British during this particular time. England engages in a war called the Opium War with China. Okay, opium is a what classification it got? It's a narcotic, but it is a, like fentanyl and heroin. It is a what? Opioid. Opioid. Yes. Thank you. Very good. So it's in the same family as those things. British merchants want the right to sell opium to the Chinese. And they go into a long war with them. And so China is looking for political allies, and President Tyler is more than happy to provide that. Okay. The Treaty of Wanghia forms diplomatic relationships between the United States and China. Okay. If we're looking for a starting point of our relationship with China, here it is. It grants the United States most favorable nation rights, which means any trade agreement China has with another nation, it will automatically have with the United States. Okay. with access to China, the United States also starts to consider Japan. Japan's a unique country. It is totally isolated. Centuries of separation between Japan and Korea and China creates three very distinct cultures and races of people there. We may not fully appreciate that, but Japan was pretty much a closed off territory, and the Japanese were highly protective of their isolation. Okay? The United States, a little bit, I would say, cocky off of its success in the Mexican-American War, decides to send a delegation to Japan to try to work out negotiations. The man for the job is Commodore Perry. And Commodore Perry must be one of these go big or go home kind of guys, because the display he puts together for when he goes into the harbor of Edo, which is present-day Tokyo, is infamous. Okay. First of all, we have steamships. And so these big ships, which the Japanese had never seen before, come belching smoke into the harbor, full display of flags. In a way, it was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. So he pulls up and he unloads a whole just trunk full of lavish goods. One of the things he leaves is a little miniature toy train set. Not like miniature as in a child can hold it in their hands, but as in a miniature train with a stretch of, like a quarter-mile stretch of track that people can ride on. So steam power and train technology are brought to Japan as gifts. You know, obviously the intention is, well, here's what it looks like in miniature. You can make this bigger, but without, well, any immediate cost. That is our bait, so to speak. Present these gifts to the people of Japan, get back on our ships, and go away. Okay, Perry promises to return a couple years later to allow the Japanese time to think, but you can tell with the way that he brings out full military regalia and full military might when he pulls in. There's sort of a ultimatum that's being presented here, or at least the sense of an ultimatum. Either you open up trade with the United States, or it will be problems for you. Perry works out the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854, and our official relationship with Japan begins. Questions about that at all? So here you can see the train set, the ships, the smokestacks, and sails, not uncommon. Questions? In a day before television, in the days where you think about how oration or public speaking was a big form of entertainment, but in the days where reading was your primary form of entertainment, you can imagine how the impact of the story of Commodore Perry and Japan would have enraptured people. I think that's it for me, folks.